Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Community Therapy. I'm Morgan Wood, and I'm your host for today's incredible conversation about empowering groups in your community. And today we're joined with Marjorie and Lana, and they're going to walk us through community building at large when it comes to working with community groups. So today we'll be specifically digging into how organizations can empower smaller groups that are existing within your community chapter. We're really excited to have these two experts join us today. So before we kick off into all things groups and building community with them, I'm going to pass the mic over to Marjorie, and then she'll pass the mic over to Lana, and then we'll jump right in.
Thanks, Morgan. Hi, everyone. My name is Marjorie Anderson. I'm the Director of Community for EXOS, which is a company that dwells in the corporate well-being space. I'm also the founder and principal strategist for Community by Association, helping associations, nonprofits, and social impact organizations think strategically about how to implement community into their overall business model. And I will kick it over to Lana.
Thanks, Marjorie. I'm the Senior Community Manager and Strategist at Zuora. We're a subscription company with finance and accounting. So we're SaaS, but I do a lot of help with community for nonprofits. And actually, my background used to be engineering, but I think I have a super fun job now. So I don't miss it at all.
Oh my goodness. And both of your organizations are so cool. And I'm so glad that you're both joining us here today to talk about building community with groups. I know with associations, and also Lana, with your background too, from dev and into your current role, there's just so many, I think, points in this conversation where we're going to say that's a highlight, that's a piece of gold, because I think both of you bring so much to the conversation when it comes to building out these small areas that can make a huge impact in a community space. So without further ado, I'm going to jump in right into it with our first question. And our first question that we have for you today is, what are the best practices you should keep in mind when you're creating a group in your community space? A lot of our community managers, at least what we see at Hivebrite, is sometimes like I think Adrian Spire has given us all the vernacular for, is like, you're an accidental community manager and you might be hearing, oh, you should start a group, you should do this. And how do you start to, as either a new community builder or a very seasoned one, start to understand when should you be building a group and what are the best practices for those?
I can start.
Thanks.
I know a lot of people, when they say, oh, you should start a group, but there's enough people, but just because you build it doesn't guarantee that they will come. So it's important to start small and build out from there. I once worked with a nonprofit and they wanted to make a community for every state in the United States. So that's all 50. And I'm like, no, I think you should go by like time zone so people can meet together, start small. So it's important to start
Yeah.
small, and even starting grassroots is okay when you don't have enough things. Just make it scrappy because people just want to come together to talk,
Yeah.
and things like that.
Oh, and that is when you gave the just a quick follow-up question, Lana, when you gave the
Mhm.
suggestion to time zone, how was that received? Because I know sometimes we are given like, we want a group for all 50 as community builders, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering how that landed with the leadership when you suggested that.
They said, interesting, we'll think about it. And they just did whatever they wanted to do. And then about like 6 months later, it was just like tumbleweeds, quiet. And
Mm,
so they closed a number of the groups.
yeah.
I'm just like eating my
And you're like,
popcorn.
yeah. You're like, wait, that's exactly what I said would happen.
Yeah, yeah. It's just like, okay, that's fine. Whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, they could take whatever they want. So
Absolutely. And Marjorie, I'm curious to hear your thoughts too, especially being in the association space. What are maybe best practices that you've picked up along the way when it comes to starting a group in a community?
Yeah, I think one of the big things that people tend to forget is that group governance is just as important as overall community governance. Like, you can't expect for there to be like, okay, here's our community and we're just gonna have groups, and because community has governance, it'll be fine. But if you've got people who are hosting those groups, the purpose of those groups are different. The culture sometimes tends to be different depending on why the group exists. And the purpose of them coming together. And so there needs to be some governance at that level as well. So the people who are hosting that group, not just the moderators of the community at large, but the people who are hosting those groups need to really understand what does it mean to ensure that trust and safety exists within those spaces. What happens if someone gets out of line? Who do we escalate to, right? So there has to be that second layer of governance that's built in there. It's certainly not a set. If your larger community is not set and forget, then your smaller communities aren't going to be set and forget either. So, as a matter of fact, they're probably going to be a little bit more complex because there's stuff happening that you may not be totally privy to, and conversations happening that might cause some other issues. So, uh, all around governance is helpful and 100% needed, and guidelines and playbooks for the folks who you're entrusting to be stewards of those groups have to be in place.
Absolutely. And that's such a good point too with guidelines. And I'm curious to hear from both of you, just kind of as a jumping off point. When you're starting to navigate to ensure that these smaller groups are staying connected to the larger picture, are guidelines really kind of that first part of starting to navigate that complex relationship between the larger community and then the group, or how do you how have you navigated that?
I think for me, it's always been about like what's the purpose of those smaller groups as it pertains to the larger group or community.
Yeah.
Um, I think that it's important that whatever the thinking is around starting smaller groups, it should be in service to the mission and vision of the larger community, right? So, group objectives and measures of success, that stuff should ladder back up to the larger strategic vision that helps move the community, the business collectively forward. There's a reason you started your community. You're not just going to pluck groups out of the sky and be like, sounds like a good idea, or maybe you do, like in the instance with with Lana's in Lana's example earlier. But I think that if they're not connected, like that's the starting point, then those guidelines and such can come in. But if the group is connected to the community, there's less of a likelihood that if things get off track or group leaders go rogue. You don't have a handle on that, right? So investigate where there's misalignment in case that does happen, but then that still gives you an anchor to come back to. But there's got to be a purpose associated with those groups, and not only a purpose, but then they should ladder back up to a larger vision and mission.
Absolutely. And I really like what you said too, Marjorie, of like, okay, taking that step back, it's not necessarily about the infrastructure of the group. It's making sure that it's connected to that larger vision, the larger mission. And I'm curious to hear too, Lana, from your perspective, when you're creating that group environment, how do you actually message that to the leaders who might be taking over that space if it's not an internal team member? So just kind of thinking about like how do you find that balance between the right amount of support and guidance without kind of stifling creativity and purpose that might it's a careful balance when you're
It
handing
is.
over the reins.
Yeah, because you don't want to be like Big Brother and or micromanage, because then they won't want to do it. You just seem
Right.
like a teacher and things like that. That's why it's really important to choose the right people as leaders and the ones that are welcome to getting guidance. Not the ones that need to have their hands held, although there might be some that have the passion, but you want to make sure that they also understand the corporate mission and the goals of the group so they don't make it all about themselves.
Yeah.
And it's also important to have like maybe like quarterly check-ins or things like that, because then at least they can meet each other and get ideas like, oh, I didn't know that this group does that. That's kind of cool. So they could share because each group will have their own flavor depending on who the organizer is. And then another thing that I try to do is invite them to VIP events. So at
Mhm.
least like, you're not having to give the message, but they feel special when you give them a red carpet treatment to a company or organization thing. But in a way, it's like they're also seeing the brand, the tone, and they sort of adopt that.
Absolutely. And Marjorie, I'm curious to hear from your experience too, especially with when it comes to like striking that balance? Because I know with associations, it can be a little like even more complex than just groups on its face value. So I'm wondering, like, what has your experience been in the association space too with building um, like groups that can be autonomous while also still connected to larger organizations?
Yeah, often in associations, what you see is that there's a level of control that the association wants to have, right? Because it's like
Yeah.
we've got to control the experience. And you're like, but these are people, you can't control them, right? So I think that really kind of leaning in and allowing allowing the voice of the community to guide the experience that they want to have is important. One of the things that I think some associations have the capability to do, some don't, just because of budget constraints or resource constraints, is really figuring out what is a good user experience strategy, what is a good voice of customer strategy, that can then help guide how they best support those groups and communities without having to have their hands in everything. One of the things that I always recommend is that if you're thinking about community, either hire a full-time community manager to kind of steward that, or hire a consultant. Someone needs to watch it. It's not something you can give your membership specialist to do off the side of their desk while they're also trying to figure out how to keep membership afloat. Like that's not a fair trade-off. It's a full-time role. But I think that once they start to see that people find value in being able to interact in a space and have voice and
Yeah.
have a little bit of agency over the experience they have in that space, they start, and as a result of that, some of those indicators that that stuff is working is that membership numbers increase, event number attendance numbers increase, consumption of content increases. Like all of that stuff starts to increase because you don't have your hand tight fisting the experience of everything that your members do. You're giving them space to say, and here's where you can lend your voice, your expertise, network with other people in a way that works for you, and making sure that you're not so stringent on what that experience looks like. Yes, have core programming. Yes, have certain things that you want to kind of have in that space, guided by member feedback. But if you are keeping the members in mind, those experiences then become less of something you have to white knuckle and hold on to, and it becomes really rewarding for the people in those spaces. So that's generally what I kind of see in associations, because associations are built in such a way that the governance around them holistically is so, and has to be so so tight, right? That an experience like that, where they're more hands off, can seem a little daunting. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, you give people a little bit of space. There's a lot of magic that can happen there.
Oh, I love that so much too, because I think even what I've seen so far in my community building experience too is even if it's not in an association space, there's a little bit of fear that comes from the unknown. And I think that's so human. We're a little nervous, like, what's going to happen if we open up this space? And I think oftentimes we, as community managers, we're like, there's so much good potential and so much magic will happen, like you said, Marjorie. But then I think especially when it can come to leadership, there's just that anxiety that something negative will come of this. And so I'm curious to hear from both of you about how can you, or how have you, or how can someone create a safe space that isn't overtly negative, right? Like kind of like that fear you might be hearing from leadership if you're a community manager listening to this, and you're thinking about launching a group. How can you kind of show that you're setting up these parameters to get to create this safe space where the magic can happen? And here's how we also balance, uh, we don't need to be controlling in this space with kind of that, maybe that anxiety from the larger organization. I know that's a loaded question and could probably be its whole own session, but I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts when it comes to that.
I usually apply the, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas sort of rule. It's just like, what
Yeah,
happens in the group should stay within the group. So you're not like having people send screenshots and be like, oh, look what this person said. Because then
yeah,
that creates conflict. And the thing is, like, sometimes it's going to happen. Because a lot of
yeah,
times, like Marjorie said, it's just like in associations, this gets a little more complicated because a lot of people that are running the groups are volunteers.
yeah,
It's not part of their daily job, unlike like the corporate space where it's just like this helps them. They could put them on LinkedIn and be like, this will help me get promotion or something like that. But
yeah,
like, for the associations, it's usually at least for the associations that I'm in, it's just sometimes it's older people that,
yeah,
they have a lot of time on their hands and they're very passionate. But
yeah.
when it comes to conflict, it's like it's really important to know that, even though you're not chiming in all the time, if there's
Mhm.
conflict, you go in and be the police like, whoa, 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 just a second,
Yep.
like, can I see your driver's and registration? It's like, no, this is look at the guidelines, things like that. So they know that somebody's watching, but not totally controlling. So they feel safe.
Absolutely. And in your experiences, is this typically a role that group leaders can play into for ensuring that trust and safety? How and then I guess the add-on question to that is how can you equip a group leader to, help walk that line between being a part of the overall, community mission and also ensuring safety and trust in that group space?
Usually I try to be, as a community manager, I try to be the fall guy or the fall
Yeah.
person, because then it's just like, because depends on who's talking to the members a lot. You don't want them to be like, oh, she doesn't want me to do that or doesn't so as long as like you sort of want them to shine as the
Yeah.
organizers. So it's okay. I'm fine with being that person to be like, here are the guardrails, be careful, otherwise I'm gonna, be the bouncer, kick you out and things
I
like that.
I love the analogies, Lana, so much. And Marjorie, I'm curious to hear too, like, how do you navigate that too within the association and group spaces just in general?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Lana said, and I think that there's when you're asking volunteers to step in and kind of play the role of the steward over their group, we also have to equip them with the tools to be able to do so and hold them to the highest standards, right? So just because Jane is your friend doesn't mean she gets to get away with whatever she wants in the community. Also, neither do you just because you're a moderator, right?
Yes.
So, and equitably applying the equity applying moderation across those lines, right? So if Susie or Mark is a moderator of a group and they're all of a sudden on a power trip, they have to be addressed just as much as a community member would, just as much as a board member who's participating in that space would, just as much as someone who's on staff who might be on a power trip, right? Like everyone is subjected to the same sort of, I don't want to say reprimand, that's not the word that I want to use, but your expectations are the same. This is a space where people are expected to come and contribute to the conversation. They can contribute content, they can help welcome other people, but by no means is this a time for you to flex your muscles. And that's how we maintain some trust and safety within that space. If people start to see the balance tipping or the scale tipping in any way and that start to become unbalanced, that really can disrupt the culture of a community or a group. And so I think it's really important to make sure that folks have the tools that they need to be able to effectively manage those groups, and then that there are escalation points and protocols in place to assure that that continues to stay balanced.
Yeah, and it's really important to do that, to do some correction because sometimes things get really heated. Sometimes people have a bad day.
Yeah.
So it's important to do that correction offline versus like the public shaming, because then that's embarrassing for them. And then people are just like, is it going to be me next? Because sometimes you want to be sarcastic and be jokey and just like, is this going to be, get
Yeah.
me public shame and things like that. So it's important to take it offline sometimes.
Yeah.
Just be like, hey, are you okay? Give people the benefit of the doubt. Are you okay? I just noticed this thing about your post, you know, and things like that.
I
So
really
also
like
it shows care for the person that's also maybe having a bad day to be like, actually, I am having a bad day. I didn't notice that, you know. We've all
yeah,
been there.
and
So,
allowing
Yeah.
people like, allowing members to self-reflect too. I think that's,
yeah.
like, a really great, note, Lana, to because that's going to create further safety, right? Like, if you're saying, "Hey," you're approaching them with benefit of the doubt and role modeling the behavior that, you'd want to be treated with if you were having a bad day too. And so you kind of exercising that caution to not come down too hard when it comes to guide.
Immediately ban, you know, because it's just like,
I,
just like,
yeah,
wait, you
especially I
know.
think in group environments, it can become a lot more contentious. And a lot of, I think at the top of this question you mentioned like no screenshots and sort of like the what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas mentality, because oftentimes I think that's the nervousness of at least from the corporate lens of a community. Like the leaders in a corporate environment are like, well, what will be said in this environment and how will it spread throughout the community? And so I'm curious if either of you have sort of like implemented like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas type of language in the commute, like the group guidelines, or is it more of the behaviors you're training your moderators to take to kind of have that type of safety?
I
Yeah,
just say, oh, go ahead, Marjorie.
no, I was just gonna say for me, for the communities that I've been involved, there's always um a blurb in the user guidelines around privacy. Not only community privacy, but user privacy. And so if that in any way gets violated, I mean that's pretty serious. So we tend to have a conversation about that. So it's 100% built into the guidelines because it's a behavioral expectation across the board. And so folks need to know that up front. I think there's some, I've heard it said before, there's some perception that being a part of an online community is open web. It's not. Like there's a reason you had to register for this community. There's a reason you had to go through an onboarding process and answer some questions, and there's a reason there are user guidelines. There's a reason that there's a privacy policy in terms of use. There's a reason all that stuff exists because it's not open web. And there's an expectation that you behave in a certain way here. So yes, we have 100% built those sorts of expectations into our user guidelines so people know upfront what is expected of them as they participate in the community.
And thank
Yeah,
you
for
so much for underscoring that too, because I do think that is something I've like have picked up on too, of like kind of the open web mentality versus like what makes a community different from that. So that's such a great highlight, Marjorie. And
because
Lana,
it's
I know you were
really
gonna
important.
do.
Yeah, it's really important because there was one group where I was a volunteer moderator, and the organization didn't have the experience to create the guidelines. And
Mm.
so the moderators were the first moderators. There was a lot of doxing involved.
Oh
Um,
no.
yeah, there
Yeah.
was doxing involved. So then after that, I stepped down because
Yeah.
I was worried they were going to be calling people's places of work and making up stories.
Yeah.
And so after that, they were just like, oh, we should have guidelines. It's like,
Mm.
you think, you know, because nowadays with the internet, there's so much that can be found. Like, you know, just you can just find
Yeah.
someone on LinkedIn, know where they work, you know, and
Yeah.
things like that. So it's really important, like Marjorie said, to have that in your rule, like terms of use, and just so you can point back to it, you know, even though
Yeah.
people gloss over it and just click, I agree. It's just like, you tick
Yeah.
the box, you agreed.
Exactly. And it really sets up
Yeah.
that level of safety. And like you said, Lana, even if they're ticking that box, it's being able to like refer back to that and say, hey, remember, this is
Yeah.
something going on. And it gives it, it sounds like what your experience was as a moderator is there weren't any guidelines to refer to, which makes a situation like that even more stressful, I can imagine, as a moderator.
Yeah. And also being consistent too. Like Marjorie said, is that just because your friend Sarah is cool, you know, she doesn't go above the guidelines as well as you know, so lead by example. Then people
Exactly.
will know it's just like, you're not above the law, so I shouldn't be either. There's no entitlement for anybody.
Absolutely. Lana, as a jumping off point from there, I'm wondering what actionable strategies have you used to identify and engage necessary stakeholders? Now that we've covered the basis of having the community guidelines and having a safe space. Now, what are strategies that can be used to identify and engage stakeholders? And Marjorie, I would love to hear your thoughts on this too.
From a corporate standpoint, I usually go with CSMs and AEs because they have contact with customers the most or the stakeholders. So then they're the customer whisperers, I like to call them. And also, I also try to give people access to SMEs. So SMEs are also like subject matter experts, the people that
Yeah.
know a lot about whatever you're talking about. They're the ones that, have seen every problem under the sun. And lastly, sometimes this may not be the first thing you think about, but sometimes the people that complain the most, that maybe fill out the most tickets because they're the most passionate. They want the product or whatever process to be better. And if you
Yeah.
ask them, it's just like, are you willing to, help out? They'll be like, oh yeah, I'd love to be a tester. It's like they're your hand raisers
Yeah.
sometimes. So sometimes you can for community managers, not all engagement is good engagement, good and bad. So sometimes the noisiest people can be your most loyal stakeholders.
That is such a good point, Lana.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, what I've seen work really well is I when I worked at PMI, I had a manager, shout out to Danny Ritter at PMI, who early on in my career was like, you should do a roadshow. I would ask her questions and she'd be like, that's very interesting that you have that question. You should go find out. She would not make it easy for me at all. And so, but what that did was that gave me the opportunity to do a roadshow throughout my organization and really talk to key business areas like our chapter development group, like our volunteer services group, like our customer care department to really understand, what are the things that you're dealing with? What are the things that you are that are that are a struggle for you, right? What are the things that we might be able to help with from a community standpoint? And here are the things that you need to know about the work that we're doing. And so it seems really simple, but really just having those open lines of communication and those lines of connection across business lines has been really, really helpful in ensuring that people, key stakeholders, stay engaged. One of the other things that we did was we held a business acumen series, and what we did was we invited senior leaders across the organization to kind of sit in on an hour-long session to get an overview of what community was. Here's what groups do. Here's how we can help. Here's where we need your help. And that continued to allow us to stay connected, not just from a community standpoint, but from a business perspective. And that allowed people to understand and see where there was synergy, where there were connections, where those teams could work together. And it got buy-in really, really quickly because not only was it went from it being, okay, someone's coming to ask us for something to, oh, there's a contribution that could be made here both ways. How do we make that happen at the benefit of the member, of the benefit of the volunteers, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was something that really worked for me in the space and even in the space that I'm in now, we still have conversations while I'm working at Exos across our pillars just to say, here's what's happening from a community perspective. And then we identify ways in which we might be able to work together to achieve common goals, not just individual goals.
And then does that make it a lot easier to then get your stakeholders involved in the group level, or what does that kind of look like for you on a day-to-day basis? Just curious.
It makes them excited to want to be, right? And so early on, when I was working at PMI, go back to PMI because I was there for 14 and a half years. But
Yeah.
when I was working at PMI, the thing that I used to hear all the time was, I don't want people trying to talk to me in the community. I'm like, they don't want to talk to you. They're not looking for you. They're not there
Yeah.
looking for the director of membership service. They don't care that you're there. They're there to talk to one another. And so as they started to see the ideas and the innovation and the things that were being said within that space, even if they were bad. I remember there was one time there were some negative comments going into the community about, I think, one of the certifications, and like we had gotten some feedback from one of the leaders, like, oh, we should probably take that out. And I'm like, we're not going to take that out. That's good feedback. Probably should pass that on to your team, right? And
Right.
so then people wanted to say, well, what else is happening in the community? What else are people saying? Like, there's a bunch of good stuff too. You should get in there and see. Trust me,
Yeah.
they're not looking for you, but if there's something in there that you can lend to the conversation to either help solve a pain point or involve them in a process that would make things easier, perfect time to do that, right? And so it as we started to kind of shift the perception of what happens when you get involved in the community from a like staff standpoint, people were a little bit more they're a little bit more easier swayed to be in
Yeah.
that space and to kind of watch and see what was going on.
Absolutely. And it sounds like too, if it's not too far of a jump, like you kind of broke the fourth wall for them when you're telling them they don't want to talk to you. They're trying
Right, right. Like they don't care that you're there.
to
They're not like I'm going to join this community to talk to the director. They don't care.
Exactly. And it kind of like gives the team like the check of like what's internal versus what's external and like where community kind of like bridges that because I think that might be like a really interesting thing for anyone listening to dig into of like is your team hesitant to get involved because they're worried about maybe their time load and then does it need to be said sort of like Marjorie said where it's not necessarily what the members are going to be focused on, like how those two things differ. So Marjorie, that is such all of that was so wonderful. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I'm gonna use that. It's like they're not here
Yeah.
to talk to you.
Like they
You're not
don't
that
care. They're
special.
not looking
Yeah.
right. Right.
Yeah.
They
You're
really don't
special,
care.
but not special.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's more of like you're bringing things to them, not they're coming to you. And I think that's such an important mindset shift, especially when working with stakeholders. Um, So I feel like we could have this conversation all day when it comes to community building and groups, but we're already to our last question. So I'll go ahead and tee it up, and then Marjorie, if you want to kick us off, and then Lana will hand it over to you for final thoughts. Our last question is how do you connect your groups to the larger goals of the organization? So just to kind of wrap up this whole conversation we've had, it would be so great to hear how do you connect your groups to the larger goals of your organization as a community builder.
Yeah, I think for me, it all starts with understanding why the groups even exist to begin with, right? It's the same thing for communities. What levers do they pull that further the overall business success and how the larger business goals help those groups succeed, right? So, really thinking of it as a cycle, a virtuous cycle versus a one-way sort of benefit is helpful. So as long as there's a good solid strategy in place, there's support, there's good governance in place, those connections should then emerge if you're thinking about holistic value and not just why it'd be nice to have groups, right? Because at the end of the day, sometimes what I've seen is leaders think to themselves, this is a good idea. I think it's a good idea. I want it to exist, but nobody asked for it. Nobody asked for it. It doesn't really have business value. And then they're like, community doesn't work. It does, but this was for you. This wasn't for the community. This wasn't for the business. Like you thought it would be cool and nobody wanted it. So, really making sure that those connections are made to ensure that there's overall value being delivered and that there's something that folks are getting out of it, both from a business perspective and a group perspective.
Yeah, so perfectly put, Marjorie.
Yeah, I'm gonna give her a +1 if we're on a news feed. But yeah,
Yes.
everything that basically everything that Marjorie said. And also, it's important to highlight the success of leaders when they do something right that aligns with the goals or even internals. Because the thing is, like, you want to highlight that they're doing the right thing, that they're aligned with the org's goal, or organization's goal, and things like that. But also, it's just like other people can learn from them, best practices, and it's always good to have an example because I like learning by example, and that's probably why I give lots of analogies because that's just how I understand things, simplify things. So at least it's just like they've iterated the organization's goal and made it their own at the same time. So it just shows like the creativity and then also the success of the community as well, and as well as groups and things like that. And it also gives another plug to be like keep the community on top of people's mind.
Yeah, that
So
that's such a great way to like I think I've think I may have mentioned this before in the last season, but like keeping a folder on your desktop where you're screenshotting when someone is like really adhering to like your community guidelines or they're showing that great behavior, whether they're a stakeholder or a community manager, and then you can have like a end of week or end of month like spotlight of like look at how great this is, not to mention being able to add it to a slide deck when you're reporting back to leadership of like what community looks like in action, because there are so many magical moments that can happen in these small spaces, but it's making sure that you're telling the story behind it too so stakeholders can actually grasp onto it, because otherwise, Marjorie, like you said, we might then have a lot of stakeholders are like, I think this is a really great idea. If they're not seeing what the members are really grabbing onto, that's where they can kind of go a little rogue, I think.
Exactly. They're like, let's just try this thing. I think it'll be great. And the members are like, no, we don't want that.
Well, any closing thoughts from either of you before we wrap up? Thank you so much for joining us today. This was a fantastic conversation. I feel like we could talk for hours.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would mention, and I think I say this every time that I have a conversation about community, is that we have to remember that it's about the people. Um, there are a lot of things from a governance perspective, from ROI and KPI perspective that leaders are going to look for. And the thing that I would just stress is that if you are taking care of the interest, well-being, and experiences of the people you're asking to engage with, um, that stuff comes. Like it is a natural progression. And so we can't forget about the fact that at the heart of these groups, at the heart of these communities are people with lives and feelings and choices to make. If we make it hard for them, they're going to choose something else. And so keeping that in mind really helps to keep them engaged and helps them feel like they're a part of something bigger and contributing to something bigger. The minute that you lose sight of that, you've lost your community.
Oh, wow. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Marjorie.
I know,
The
mic drop. Yeah.
a mic drop moment, and we'll
Yeah.
leave it at that. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of Community Therapy, and all of the odds and ends that we mentioned will be in the show notes. And thank you so much, Marjorie and Lana.
Sure. Thanks for having
Thanks